It's very confusing to tell a Scot that you too are Scottish, and then when they ask you where you were born, you say Idaho. After living in the UK for over 10 years, I've learned that there's a general distrust and sense of confusion, quite honestly, that many people in European countries feel when they hear Americans say things like, oh, I'm Irish, or I'm Scottish, or German, or Italian. Sometimes, as Americans, we'll say something like, oh, I'm Italian-American, but often we just drop the American suffix and just say, I'm Italian. In this video, sponsored by MyHeritage, we'll talk about where this comes from and the arguments on both sides about nationality versus ancestry. We'll also explore the deeper meanings and cultural reasons that this might have become a thing. Let's start with the argument as to why Americans do this. One internet poster says, if I say to another American that I am Irish or Scottish, it is 100% implied that I am talking about my ancestry. If someone says it to you, he or she is probably just trying to be friendly and relate to you, God forbid. Getting a little sassy there, but we'll start with point number 1 on the why Americans do this argument. From a linguistic perspective, within the country, Americans do know and understand that by saying I'm Scottish, they're referring to their ancestry, not their nationality. So while it sounds weird across the pond, and many people would argue, you're not Scottish, you're American. Within the country, when Americans talk to each other, they know that saying, oh, my family's Italian means that it is the ancestry, not that they've ever been to Italy or have Italian passports. This gets very confusing when you mix in people who are actually Italian or when Americans come abroad and start telling people they're Italian, but most Americans clearly understand that they are not Italian or Scottish or Irish or whatever it is by nationality. Now, my next point is that because the US is such a young country, the only people with a long family history are Native Americans. The rest are all from elsewhere and not that long ago. It's why America is known as the melting pot. Take my family, for example. My dad's dad, so my grandpa, was born in the United States, but his parents, my great-grandparents, were both German by nationality, born in Germany, and they moved to the United States as immigrants as adults and then had children there. Unfortunately, I never met my great-grandparents, but a great-grandparent is not that far back to be able to trace the actual roots from somewhere else. I was actually able to look all of this up with the help of MyHeritage, who I've partnered with for this video in order to investigate my own family history. In my life as an immigrant myself to the UK, the idea of identity and where you come from has always been close to my heart, so MyHeritage was the perfect place to start learning more about my own background because for some reason, Grandpa never brought the 1950 US Census to the family dinner table to share, so I'd never seen it before. If you haven't heard of MyHeritage, they're the world's leading service for family history research and DNA testing. With over 90 million users, they make building your family tree a really easy activity and give you access to tools to help you research, build your tree, and learn more about new relatives and historic moments for your family. To build your tree is really simple, even if you don't have a lot of information on your family. I was able to add my great-grandfather by searching what I did know in their database of over 20 billion documents. And actually, to my surprise, I found a comprehensive record of who he was. There's also some smart features called instant discoveries and smart matches that automatically help connect you to new relatives, documents, and photos. I got alerted to this record match about my own grandfather, showing me the 1950 US federal census, which included the exact address he lived when he lived in Salt Lake City in the year 1950. This honestly helped me feel a little bit closer to him as he never talked too much about his life in Utah, but he spent most of his childhood there. MyHeritage also has advanced AI technology to help repair, enhance, and colorize your historic family photos. You can just upload and let AI work its magic on bringing these photos to life, and then you can actually add them to your family tree and to the records you can start creating about these family members. If you want to learn more about your own family history and get access to the huge collection of records on MyHeritage, you can get a 14-day free trial by using the link in the description below or scanning the QR code on the screen. Now, the next reason Americans typically identify with other countries is that when an American says, my family's Italian, even though they've never actually been there, they're also trying to communicate to other Americans the types of things their family might participate in the US. So for instance, many Italian Americans American families in the US are known for eating Italian food on Christmas Day rather than the traditionally American ham. And for example, using myself again, my grandparents were known for making German dishes that were passed down by their parents and grandparents, despite the fact that my grandfather never went to Germany. It's a way of belonging to another subset or group that helps give a sense of identity and communicate, here's how I might be different from you. And while there are many positive qualities about Americans, it can't be denied that there lacks a historic and cultural depth in what it means to be an American. What do you think of when you think of being American? Probably hot dogs and hamburgers, big cars, and the 4th of July. And many Americans do love those things and feel a huge sense of patriotism, but being able to attach themselves to a more established culture and history is a way to give more depth to their identity. But is it right to do this? What about the people who, by nationality, for example, are actually Scottish? There are a lot of arguments made by this side on why it's strange that Americans try to claim these things, so let's give their side of the story. We'll start with this Scottish internet poster who says this. I used to work for a travel company, and I always used to get Americans asking where places were because they were part Scottish and that's where their ancestors came from. And I'd get them trying to tell me all about where I'm from like they actually knew better than me, an actual full-blood Scot. So argument number one on this side is that most Americans have never been to or know about the places that they say they identify with. About 70% of Americans have traveled abroad, but included in those statistics are people who have been to Canada or Mexico or like a Caribbean island on a cruise, which is much easier from the US. The number of Americans who have actually been to Europe is a lot smaller, and the number of Americans who have actually been to the country they identify with is even smaller. So to a Scottish person who is obviously born there, living there, actually Scottish, hearing Americans say their family is Scottish or they are Scottish just seems absurd. And because of the way Americans are using the term to represent ancestry, many won't be able to point out most iconic places in that country on a map if they can even find the country itself. Being Scottish to an American is simply referring to a sort of intangible history and roots rather than knowing the difference between Inverness and Aberdeen, and that can be annoying. Another argument is that Americans seem to only pick the most stereotypical aspects of the country they identify with. So for example, somebody who calls themselves Irish American or says, my family's Irish, might be really over the top about wearing green on St. Patrick's Day, but not actually understand any of the actual Irish history, customs, or culture. And the recipes and cuisine do change within immigrant communities, so even when eating what an American of Italian descent might consider Italian food, it may not actually be what the people in Italy are even eating. So it can come across as disingenuous and kind of using nationality as a fashion accessory. Another argument is really about the idea that, for example, a Scottish person is likely going to be very proud of being Scottish and claim it, rightfully so, obviously, as their identity. But unless perhaps one of their parents is from elsewhere, so they have a genuine connection to another country, Scotland comes first for them. Americans say, oh, my family's Scottish, and start showing off their kilt that they bought on their single visit to Scotland, then in the next breath say that they're proud to be American. It comes across a little bit like you have to pick. Are you American or are you Scottish? Are you turning cultural identity into a collector's item? Now, what are my thoughts on the matter? I think it's fascinating as an American to be able to explore these ties to other countries that are really close in the family tree to me, and I had a lot of fun doing this in my own family research with my heritage. Reading old censuses and learning more about my own grandparents. Didn't realize my grandfather had a trellis building company at one point when he was younger, for example, was very interesting, and I loved being able to look back and see the documents from Germany that belonged to my great-great-grandparents. But I do think we should take care in how we express this to people who are actually from those countries. I don't see any problem with telling a Scot that you're of Scottish descent because your great-great-grandparents were from there and you have an interest in their culture. In fact, I bet many Scots would welcome that. But it's very confusing to tell a Scot that you too are Scottish, and then when they ask you where you were born, you say Idaho. So a bit of clarification is needed. Now, whether you are from Scotland or from Idaho, don't forget that you can help figure that out with a 14-day free trial of MyHeritage using the link in my description to see how far back you can trace your own family tree. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.